Okay, so in this video, I'm going to carry on the theme of talking about dilemmas in international business, which, if you remember, I equated them to being issues that were arising in international business within economy that sort of pull apart the assumptions of innovations in leading to economic and growth and human betterment. And I said that these are dilemmas because we can relate them to ethics, to morals and ethics, to positions about whether these are good or bad. And these are questions that we need to ask about our current economic system. I started off by talking about inequality, in that inequality in both income, wealth, and opportunity is increasing and has been increasing since the dawn of the financialization era, the early 1980s. In this video and the subsequent video, I'm going to talk about work and working patterns. Work is integral to our economy in that in order to be able to live, to survive and to thrive, one is required to work, to sell one's labor, in other words, in return for money through which we buy goods and services, which makes our life more fulfilled and more comfortable. Now, the logic goes that as firms become more productive, more profitable, then the workforce gains from this. However, is that the realities? So let's explore the issue a bit further. The narrative so far, implications for work in our post-industrial society. We talked about moving from industrial production into a post-industrial production, which involves knowledge and abstract knowledge at that. But then that's aligned with the capacity for us to spread our businesses or globalize our businesses through nothing, which is not an absence of something, but there's a definite material dimension to it. Now, currently is that we're talking about flexible organizations and the requirement to be flexible or agile, as it's often referred to now. And flexible businesses and flexible profit making requires flexible labor. But where is the onus on being flexible really? How flexible are businesses, and is really the requirement in our productive or in our economic system for labor to demonstrate the utmost flexibility, to work shift patterns, irregular hours, to be on call most of the time, and through COVID, to be on call even when we're in our own homes? The old productive work, mass production, the Fordist sort of production systems of routinized and standardized jobs in large bureaucratic organizations are in decline and being replaced by project work, flexible working, if you wish. The issue is here is that although the jobs that might have been standardized, routinized, and in large bureaucratic organizations don't sound overly appealing, is that actually they were pretty well paid. And there was a series of benefits that was accrued alongside them too. So moving from that is the workforce is required to be skilled in knowledge-related tasks, brain-powered tasks as opposed to manual trades, be creative and be adaptable, flexible and agile to new tasks that come along. And this results in the death of what's been referred to as organization man. Organization man, possibly like my parents that would go to work for a particular company, perceived that they had a good job and therefore would rise through the ranks slowly but inexorably towards retirement and pension. So because the pension would be built in as a benefit of working within that company. But the organization man therefore became part of the organization. Their identity was imbued within the organization itself. The organization of man, because of flexibilization and agility, however you want to refer to it, has been replaced by the portfolio worker. No longer does the worker work for the same organization through a career, through a working life. is that one is faced with portfolio working, where one project is replaced by the next project. So people entering the workplace now can expect to work for a number of different employers through their working lives, and as a consequence, spend a considerable amount of their time either looking for work or actually being unemployed. There's also the requirement that if one takes a job because one's been unemployed for a period of time and is facing debts or the requirement to pay loans or to just pay for life in general, is that there's a temptation or a requirement that individuals just take work, but it might be work for which one is overqualified. And so there is also the possibility that whilst individuals might be searching for work, spend a proportion of their time being unemployed, there's also the possibility that whilst employed, the self-same individuals will be underemployed too. And then what we have seen more recently is a rise in ultra flexible labour, which is in essence insecure. I'll talk about this later on, but we're talking about gig working really, but short-termist working or non-guaranteed working conditions. And Ford produced a paper in 2015, which I think is quite interesting, which he identified 6 disturbing trends in labour patterns: stagnant wages, a bear market for labour and a bull market for capital, a bear and a bull being the opposite spectrum or the opposite ends of a spectrum in the way that a market performs. And the reason they're known as bulls and bears is because of the way that the animal in question would incapacitate or kill its prey. The bull would raise its head up and strike upwards with its horns, whereas a bear would use its paw to strike downwards. A bull market therefore indicates a growing market, whereas a bear market indicates a declining market. This point made by Ford is that there is a declining market for labour, but there is a bull market, a growing market for capital accumulation, wealth generation, which leads to soaring inequality, which we touched upon last time, diminishing job creation, declining incomes and underemployment, particularly for graduates, and insecure working, the ultimate inflexibilization of the workforce. Now, what I said earlier on is that there is the assumption that productive gains in efficiency gains are shared by labour. And, you know, really this sits at the crux of why an individual would want to work in a particular company and work hard for that company. Because ultimately, the perception is that one would gain from one's own labours in increased wages or bonuses. However, the growth of the real hourly compensation rates for production and non-supervisory workers versus increases in productivities can be seen to have split at around about the early 1970s, and that whilst income rates have stayed pretty flat over that period, productivity rates have soared. This has inevitably led to increased profits, but where has the profits gone? Do the workforce share in it? Now, prior to that, from the 50s, from the time of Bretton Woods, from the 1950s onwards up to the 1970s, is that labour had enjoyed gains in productivity through increased earnings. But for that bifurcation, that split, although if you look at that graph a little bit more closely, I'd probably fair to say that actually the real split occurs just around about the time where we refer to the financialisation era in the 1980s. I did say in the last lecture is that in the end of the 1970s is that the power relationship had tilted over, and that labour held more power than actually the owners of capital. So you can see that there's a drop, there's a correction there from the, around late 1970s, early 1980s. But from then on in, there's hardly any growth at all. Hardly any growth at all. Now, there's what's referred to as a social contract here, in that employers offer a social contract, or there's a social contract in order to say that workforce, firms and government work together in a sort of like a binding but unofficial contract, which leads towards economic benefit, increased levels of wealth, to the point where it's usually been said that, you know, one generation will have a better life than the previous generation. Well, currently that's not necessarily the case, in that life expectancy and income suggest that people of your age might not necessarily always enjoy the benefits that your parents had. So I did say, where's the money going? Well, this graph indicates quite readily where the money's going, into increased profits. Is that firms were very profitable back in the early 1950s, became less profitable as that income that's earned by firms is passed on in productivity gains to individuals through increased salaries and earnings, and then that slowly dissipates away and profits increase during the era of after the recessionary periods of the 1980s anyways, that profits grow and currently are at a peak over their histories, over recent histories anyway. So revenue gains and efficiency gains are generating higher profits, but the workforce who are responsible for productivity gains and income gains and profit gains are not sharing in the growth to the same extent. And if we look at this chart, which shows median wages for a number of different jobs, is that you can see where the highest median wages are derived. It's in management. And where the lowest median wages are derived is in things like hairdressing and childcare, which is interest on food preparation as well, which we talk about food prep and food service in hospitality, which is interesting because in recent times, the growth areas for work have not been in IT and management, although they have grown a bit, is that the real growth is in things like care and personal services. Care in terms of looking after people, either in nursing or in looking after the elderly, and in personal services, things like beauticians, hairdressers, and things like that. So the growth is in lower paid work. And also, it's not necessarily the kind of skilled work that Bell had envisaged in his post-industrial era, or does it show the meritocracy that Castells argued the networked economy would be? Just looking at real incomes and median real incomes over a period of time, and I've said this before, I think, but the green line shows median incomes in the United States. To say that from the 1980s, and actually I've got figures to show that it goes back, predates this by another decade, but since the 1980s, is that real median incomes in the United States have not grown at all. And whilst income rates in the UK were growing, is that since the global financial crisis, they've seriously declined. So again, this is more evidence to suggest that corporate gains are not being shared with the employers, with the workforce. This is a rather detailed graph, and scrutiny of it shows, if you look at the private sector production compensation, which is the kind of like the second set of target, the second two columns. So you've got based on options realized, based on options granted, then you've got all private sector workers. And you can see private sector annual median work in thousands is 54,000. It's the bottom figure of the two in 2017. But if you look at the go to the end and look at CEO to work and compensation ratio, which is a point I made in the earlier lecture on inequality, is that the based on realized figure, based on options realized, shows that actually is that the CEO to worker ratio is some 300 times what the average worker or the median worker is earning in the US. So there's a huge disparity between medium workers and senior management, basically. Now, is that necessarily wrong? No, not necessarily. But do the ratios have to be quite so high? And what is the right ratio for a chief executive to earn? When the chief executive, apparently earns, well, there's an argument, isn't there, to suggest that, your salary or your earnings are commensurate with the amount of value. One assumes that must be economic value that is earned. Well, the chief executive that earns 300 times median wages doesn't do the productive work. They don't work on the front line, but nevertheless, they seem to be able to claim that they are attributable to that work, or that they are responsible for that work. And the next issue is related to job creation. Remember, these are all pertaining back to Ford's 6 disturbing trends. Is that there is a view that as technology changes, is that the workforce changes, and you get a churn of jobs from the outgoing kind of like technological work into the new form of technological work. And this is described as technological unemployment. But this is not considered to be much of an issue, because compensation theory suggests, which is a Marxist idea, by the way, suggests that as one technology takes over from another technology and jobs are destroyed, is that new jobs are created by the new technologies. And people look back in history and say, look, we've seen this before, is that when we move from an agrarian economy into an industrial economy, is that there were different jobs, but there were lots of new jobs that were created by the Industrial Revolution, people moving into the cities, and gained better working lives, certainly less risky than trying to feed oneself on a farm, or working, in a sort of like a tied capacity with the local landowner. And historically, is that one can see that these trends have been continued, is that as one technology takes over, they compensate for the technological employment that the destruction in the other work and working types has become apparent. But once you start to look at job creation by decades, is that the amount of jobs that have been created from the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s and onwards is declining. From 2007, post global financial crisis, is that it's been referred to as a jobless recovery, in the net new jobs that were created are almost equivalent to zero post the global financial crisis. And that the new forms of technology are not creating the same amount of jobs that they are destroying. The argument being is that technology is nothing to be feared in terms of work, because there is new jobs to be created. Well, that doesn't appear to be the case empirically. And either intuitively does it appear to be the case either, because if what we're doing is that we're losing jobs to technological production through ICTs, robots, and artificial intelligences, is that there just aren't enough job opportunities servicing the robots and the artificial intelligences. Particularly if we genuinely get artificial intelligences or intelligent softwares whereby they will fix their own problems. So the work of the future is problematic. If you remember all the way back to, I think it was week 2, and a book by Cornai, I think, who criticised capitalism for creating excessive demand, but actually restricting the supply, but depressing the demand for labour. It creates demand for goods, but doesn't create a demand for labour. If you think about it, firms become more efficient, outsourcing, robotics, capital intensity production, and so on and so forth. There's lesser requirement for labour. And that's replicated in this particular chart to the point where we've got where new jobs, net new jobs, is not created. This raises questions about what the work of the future is going to be like. And as I've already stated, is that those jobs that have been created tend to be in care and personal services. Is there an infinite demand for hairdressers, nail technicians, gym instructors, coffee bar baristas? It's a problem, isn't it? And if you look at graduate working, and we've witnessed declining graduate income and opportunity. Now, it's worth pointing out that the situation is worse for younger people that are not graduates, but graduates have experienced the same kind of churn that the majority of people are experiencing too, is that there is a requirement for a skill-biased technological change. In 2010, incomes for graduates were 60% higher than those with A-levels. So graduates are still benefiting. Incomes for a graduate at bachelor's level declined, however, by 15% in the first decade of the 21st century. In 2012, 25% of US graduates are unemployed. The figures are worse for some European countries like Spain, Spain and France, and I think also Italy. A degree certainly provides the benefits, but these may be declining, which is why we're seeing an extraordinary number of young graduates taking up opportunities to continue their education and to try and create distinction for themselves in the marketplace by doing master's degrees, higher degrees. More people are doing master's degrees than ever, I think, you know. And I'm not necessarily talking about the sort of like the gold-plated MBA where you do your bachelor's degree, maybe do 7 to 9 years work, then go and do the MBA. Is that people are going from 3 years of undergraduate work straight into their master's degrees. And personally speaking, I've witnessed quite a large growth in this because I'm very often asked to do references for students that are applying to do other courses. And, you know, that's borne out by the fact that the opportunities of yesteryear are not there to the same extent that they used to be. And then we've got flexibilization, the idea of flexibilization or agile working. Giant companies have become flexible, or have claimed at least that they're flexible. Operations are outsourced, the head office is relocated, tax commitments minimized, geographies dispersed, functions diversified, pace is unstable and rapid, and plans short-term and changeable. They become immaterial, in other words. Structurally and relationally, transnational enterprises have evolved from company organizations to a loosely confederated network structure, a global web of loosely affiliated employees in which many discrete fabrication activities and services are brought in for the short term, bringing people in for the short term on short-term contracts. So the ultimate flexibilization is with the workforce, not necessarily with the corporation itself. And this has led to a growth in insecure working. As I've already pointed out, the growth areas of work are in low-wage service sectors, care, hairdressing, hospitality, and high-skilled work that requires substantial investment in additional training. And that is a barrier to entry in many cases. By August 2013, approximately 5 million full-time jobs have been lost, but the number of part-time jobs had increased by 3 million. So there are opportunities in high-skilled work, but it's insecure. It might well be working on a contract-by-contract basis. The percentage of the workforce engaging in part-time work, as I've just said, is growing. We've got two bar charts here, the green and the yellow. You've got two bars on this bar chart, green and yellow. The green is for men, and the yellow, or the gold, is for women. So there is a gender bias here. The majority of part-time work is being done by women. Now, there's an argument to say that this is people's choice. It fits in around lifestyle and so on and so forth. However, that's not necessarily borne out when the same person, be it male or female, is working 3 or 4 part-time jobs in order to make ends meet. Part-time working or rise in part-time working there's also a discernible rise in temporary contracts that stipulate an end period. So you're working for 6 months or 3 months or whatever the period might be. Within the university itself, there are several thousand my fellow colleagues that are engaged on temporary contracts, which are renewed on an annual basis, which is all well and good to an extent, but it really actually limits the amount of planning that one can do. And as one contract, the end of a contract looms, how much of your time do you spend looking for the next contract as opposed to actually being committed to the firm that you're working for? But temporary contracts are growing too. So I'll leave part 1 there, having painted this picture of these 6 disturbing global trends as highlighted by Ford, and we'll come back to that in the second part of the video later.